Welcome to the Friday Men's Breakfast Podcast, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. In this week's lesson from the book of 1 Samuel, Brian Owens takes us through the account of David's life, where he realizes he cannot serve two kings at the same time. So open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 29 and join us as we continue to learn what happens when the king that you think you want is not God.
We are now approaching the climax of this book in which we've been learning about what happens when the king we think we want isn't God. And the plot has been mainly focused on two men, King Saul and King David. King Saul, of course, is the first king of Israel. When the people rejected God as their king and asked for a king like all the other nations, they were given this prototypical king, tall, handsome Saul. He started off well, but then he became proud and he became self-interested and self-centered and loyal to the throne more than he was to God. And then we have David. And David is the man after God's own heart, and he's the humble one, and he's flawed, yes, but he is referred to as this man after God's own heart, full of faith. He's intimate with the Lord. He knows him. He's the sweet psalmist of Israel. And Saul has tried his best to kill David multiple times. David's been on the run, waiting for God to deliver him and fulfill his promises to him without attempting to do it for God. Contrast that with like Abraham, who was given a promise and tried to help God out. David's not doing that. David is waiting for the Lord to fulfill his promises to him. His patience and his humility demonstrate that he's fit to serve as king because, unlike Saul, he is not loyal to the throne. He's loyal to the God of Israel and the people of Israel. And so he's ready. God's preparing him to be ready to serve as king. And so we've had many fantastic subplots, characters, and stories that have brought us to this boiling point today in this what's been a slow, painful, contentious transition of power from King Saul to the next man God has chosen to lead his people, which is King David. And so let's set the scene this morning. David has defected to the Philistines to escape Saul, but his heart has remained loyal to Israel. We know that his heart has remained loyal to Israel for two reasons. One, he's been lying to Achish about the source of these payments he's been making to Achish, who's provided cover for him. He's been conducting raids, and he's telling Achish that he's been conducting these raids against Judah. But actually, he's been killing the Amalekites and wiping out man, woman, and child so that no one's left to rat on him as to the source of these raids. And then he takes the plunder and he brings it back to Achish, and Achish is none the wiser. We also know that his refusal to touch the Lord's anointed is the very reason he's now with the Philistines. Remember, he could have killed Saul already multiple times, but he refused to do that because he is loyal to the God of Israel. So he doesn't touch the Lord's anointed. And so we have every reason to believe that even though David has defected to the Philistines, he is still faithful in his heart to the God of Israel. The problem is he's done too good a job lying to Achish. Achish now trusts David. He's made him his personal bodyguard. Not only that, Achish is now taking David into battle against Israel with him. And David is stuck between a rock and a hard place, seemingly having no choice but to play along and go to battle against Israel. Meanwhile, King Saul has been left to his own devices. As Dale taught us last week, he has made the mistake of consulting a medium in Endor to find out firsthand from Samuel that God has indeed rejected him and that he and his sons are going to die in this pending battle with the Philistines the next day. And so today we're going to dive into the next scene in our study, in a study this morning I've titled, "Which King Are You Serving?" And so with that as context, pick it up with me in verses 1 and 2, and let's see what happens. Then the Philistines gathered together all their armies at Aphek, and the Israelites encamped by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and by thousands. But David and his men passed in review at the rear with Achish. Now, who are these Philistines? We have a couple scripture references to help us out here. First, back in Judges 3, verse 3, it says, "These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. The 5 rulers of the Philistines," and then, of course, these other peoples that were left in the land, so that the people who didn't experience the warfare under Joshua could still find that muscle to go and learn war. God left these nations. And we're told in Judges 3:3 that there are 5 rulers of the Philistines here. And again, in the book we're studying, back in chapter 6, you'll remember when the Philistines stole the ark, they got tumors. It says the 5 rulers of the Philistines saw all this, and they returned that same day to Ekron. The number of the gold rats, remember they made these gold rats and tumors to send back with the ark. It says the number of gold rats was according to the number of Philistine towns belonging to the 5 rulers, the fortified towns with their country villages. I borrowed Dale's map from last week. I think it's a very good map. But just to kind of give us a picture of these 5 Philistine lords who are marching in review, it's Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These are the 5 nations of the Philistines, the 5 lords of the Philistine people. And the king over all the kings is Achish, and he's the king of Gath. David has sought refuge from Achish down in Ziklag, and Achish has given him this land for him and his 600 men to take refuge away from Saul. And so these red arrows are pretty helpful. Basically, in our story, what's about to happen is the Philistines and David are going to Aphek, which I think I have a laser here. Yeah, right up here. And they're about to go up to Jezreel to fight Saul and the Israelites. Now, in Aphek, we're told in verses 1 and 2 that the lords of the Philistines are passing in review, or maybe your translation just says they're passing on, passing by. This likely refers to a pre-battle military inspection or a parade of soldiers of some kind. And this would give the generals a chance to make sure everyone is where they belong. Perhaps give the warriors a last-minute speech to fire them up before the attack. I kind of think of this scene from Braveheart. Or choose your movie with a battlefield of choice where there's kind of that guy on horseback riding up and down the lines, checking to make sure everyone's there, maybe getting them riled up for the fight. And as they're making rounds amongst the various groups of fighters, they get to the back and they realize one of these things is not like the others. And it causes a problem. So pick it up with me in verse 3. Then the princes of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? To this day I have found no fault in him since he's defected to me." There are likely 2 reasons that David is at the back. First, it could be that he's hoping to stay out of the fight, or at least be camouflaged behind the rest of the army. Could also be that Achish is anticipating pushback from his Philistine lords, and so he assigns David to be his personal bodyguard at the back, hoping that they don't notice. But Achish's strategy here is to react to their questions if he's surprised. "What do you mean? This is David. You guys know David. David's been with me these days. I mean years. He's great. Don't worry about him." But his response doesn't seem to satisfy the other lords. Pick it up in verse 4. The princes of the Philistines were very angry with him, and so the princes of the Philistines said to him, "Make this fellow return, that he may go back to the place which you have appointed to him." This is Ziklag. They're sending him back. "Do not let him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, In David, his 10,000s. The princes of the Philistines demand that David be sent back to Ziklag, and they cite two reasons. First, bringing David into battle with us is a threat because it's a prime opportunity for him to get back in Saul's good graces by simply turning on us in the middle of the battle. He's at the back after all. How are we supposed to focus confidently on what's in front of us when we know the whole time David and his 600 men are right behind us? The second reason that they give is this isn't just any Israelite. This is David. Let's not forget that there was a time that he killed so many of us, Achish, that they sang songs about it. He killed tens of thousands of us. We probably shouldn't have him behind us in this battle. It's probably a pretty stupid idea to bring him along, Achish. Well, in other words, what the lords of the Philistines are pointing out is that David is out of place. F.B. Meyer says this in commenting on the King James Version of this passage. He says, "It is very terrible when the children of the world have a higher sense of Christian propriety and fitness than Christians themselves, and say to one another, 'What do these Hebrews here?'" Now, as followers of Jesus Christ, the world knows good and well when we are in a place that we don't belong. And they are not shy about calling us out when they recognize it. Have you ever found yourself in a place where you knew that you didn't fit? Where you awkwardly were standing out as different and not in a good way? It happened to me this morning on the way here on Bypass Road. Going 42 and a 25, I got a speeding ticket, and the Philistine officer pulled me over and said, "What are you doing here?" So then I had to explain I'm going to a Bible study, and I'm supposed to teach it this morning. But the world is quick to call us out when we're in the wrong. Now, we can stand out in two ways. First, by contrast to the world, that lets our good works so shine among men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. That's good. Or we can stand out by conformity to the world that doesn't match our profession or our good reputation that we've built in the past. Now, contrast to the world is great. It's what we're going for. We want to live in such a way that we have a good reputation amongst those who are outside the church, and we hope to live in such a way that they see a difference and are drawn to Jesus for a taste of the living water that they know we possess. But inappropriate conformity to the world is not what we're going for. And if we're not careful, we can err too far on either side here. Just a quick couple of New Testament scripture references to help guide our thinking on this tightrope that we feel like we walk sometimes. First, the fact that we are called to be separate. From 1 Peter, he says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." So Peter's like, you guys have spent enough time with the world, living like the world, doing the things with the world. And when you don't do that now, by the way, you're going to stand out. There's a contrast that's expected. They're going to make fun of you. They're going to think that it's strange that you're not going to the drinking party. But on the other hand, we have Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, "I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world." Why? Because everyone in the world is a sinner, right? If you tried to completely remove yourself and be a monk in a temple somewhere and just not interact with the world at all, you'd have to leave the world. There's just nowhere to go. Everybody's a sinner, and so there's balance, right? There's contrast we're called to live differently by, but there's also the fact that we need to reach the world. So I think a couple of pitfalls for us to avoid in this topic is when we're dealing with contrast with the world, we do want to let our light shine, be open about our faith in Jesus and how he impacts our life, to live different from the world. What we don't want to do is refuse to be around non-Christians, isolate ourselves, and be holier than thou, pharisaical people. Now, when it comes to witnessing to the world, we do want to attend social gatherings when appropriate, not the drinking parties, but attend social gatherings, make friendly acquaintance with the world, serve others unconditionally. But what we don't want to do is participate in sinful activities and actively hurt our witness with our actions. And I think this is David in our story this morning has gone a little too far in his relationship to the world. He's crossed over from contrast to conformity. So just by way of a quick checkup of sorts for us, are we different? If we are contrasted with the world, what that will look like is different fruit. We'll have love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. But when we've conformed to the world, same fruit. Complete lack of the Holy Spirit's fruit and all of the turmoil we find in the world. When we're contrasting our lives with the world, we have different conduct. We don't do the same things. We don't speed down Richmond Road. But when we are conformed to the world, we drive like the world. So we have different values. I have this this friend of mine. Her name is Miss Phyllis. She's in her early 90s. She's the sweetest woman you've ever met. I went to her house one day with Mandy, my wife, and we noticed Phyllis doesn't have a television in her house. And I asked her about that. She said, "There's nothing on there that reflects my values." I thought, man. Or we have the same values as the world, right? We hold things to be important that they hold to be important when we're conforming to the world. We have a different hope. We do not sorrow as others who have no hope. When we sorrow, we have hope in the resurrection, that one day we're going to see our loved ones again, and that Jesus is going to keep his promises to us. But when we're conformed to the world, we have the same misplaced hopes. We hope in material blessing and provision and things that can't ultimately take care of us. And then ultimately, we have a different king when we live in contrast to the world. We serve someone else. Versus when we're conformed to the world, we have the same king serving the God of this world. So just take that in as devotional thoughts this morning of just a checkup. Are we living in contrast to the world, or have we become conformed to this world? So continuing on in our passage, look again there at verse 6 and 7. Then Achish called David and said to him, "Surely as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me, and the army is good in my sight. For to this day I have not found evil in you since the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, the lords do not favor you. Therefore, return now and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." Now, as the Lord lives, that's an odd phrase for a Philistine king to use, right? Perhaps Achish has been influenced positively to a degree by David. Or perhaps Achish is simply being respectful to David, which I think is more likely here. But either way, has David been upright in his going out and his coming in with Achish? No. David has been living a double life. He has paid his tribute to Achish for his protection, but he hasn't been honest about the source of those payments. Remember, David has been leading Achish to believe that the spoils of his team's raids are coming from Israel. That is, of course, untrue. And instead of confessing to this, David continues with the lie. Look at verse 8. So David said to Achish, "But what have I done? And to this day, what have you found in your servant as long as I have been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" David is nothing if not loyal. Surprisingly, he doesn't simply take the open door that God has given him to escape the situation. He protests the decision and insists that he wants to fight for Achish, and even refers to Achish as his lord the king and the Israelites as his enemies. David did owe Achish a debt for taking him and his men in and giving them Ziklag, as somewhat of a city of refuge to hide from Saul. If I were David, I would be tempted to take the opportunity to face Saul on the battlefield like a man, an honorable fight. In fact, David hinted that this may be the fate of Saul back in chapter 26, verse 10. He said that it may be that Saul will die in battle, and that's why he didn't kill him then. But now, man, I've got an opportunity. I could run into battle and maybe deal with this head on. But giving into such a temptation would ruin David. How would it look if David killed the king of Israel in battle alongside the Philistines? Would the people ever trust him? I don't think so. It's important for us to remember and call out here that God promises us in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. The wise thing for David to do here is recognize the way of escape that God has just provided to him and say thank you and hightail it out of there. The same is true for us. Look for the way of escape that God has promised to provide you. It will be there. In my experience, most often, the way of escape that God has provided has come in the form of my own 2 feet. And I simply need to exercise my legs and get out of the situation I know I don't belong in. That being said, this rock and a hard place that David finds himself in is clear. The problem is that David has a divided heart. He is trying to serve 2 kings. On the one hand, I have to believe that he would not actually engage in battle against Israel and Saul based on his known character and his track record. He clearly has allegiance to the God of Israel. But on the other hand, Achish has shown him favor, and even now when the other Philistines are rejecting him and Saul has rejected him, Achish is the one guy who seems to have unwavering belief and support for David. And David likely feels some allegiance to him. Now, for 33 weeks in a row, we've heard various speakers say from this pulpit, 1 Samuel teaches us what happens when the king we think we want isn't God. If any chapter in this book highlights that lesson, it's this chapter. This is what happens when the king we think we want isn't God. Jesus tells us it this way in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve 2 masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or God and Achish. Thankfully, for David, God forces him to the off-ramp circumstantially and providentially. Pick it up with me in verses 9 through 11. Then Achish answered and said to David, I know that you are as good in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now therefore, rise early in the morning with your master's servants who have come with you, and as soon as you are up early in the morning and have light, depart. So David and his men rose early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, we must zoom out at the conclusion of our chapter here to ponder the sovereignty and goodness of God in this book. God has chosen David to be the next king. By preventing him from making a huge mistake here, he does a few things. First, he ensures that David will be able to reign over Israel in the future, even though I'm sure in David's mind that's never going to happen at this point. The second thing God does is he redirects David and his men to a task that they need to be focused on that they don't even know about yet back in Ziklag, which we will read about next week. So stay tuned. It's a good thing David's not going to this battle because there's a different one that he really needs to be involved in. And the third thing is it shows David that God will fight his battles for him. Ultimately, God has become Saul's enemy. We read that in chapter 28, verse 16. And God will fulfill his judgment against Saul as he said he would do. Now, whenever God circumstantially shuts a door in our lives, it's for our own protection and for our good. I think, unfortunately, there's a beautiful verse that's become a little too familiar for Christians who've been walking with the Lord for too long, but we should remind ourselves of this truth constantly. In Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. I think David fits that category. Now, it may be that God is preventing you from engaging in a vocation or relationship or an activity that would prevent you from fulfilling a higher calling he has in your life later on. It may be that God is redirecting you to a more important task that needs your attention, that you're not even aware of. And by closing this door, he's about to make you aware of something else that requires your attention right now. Or lastly, it may be that the battle you're facing is a battle that God is going to fight for you. And his word to you today is simply stand still and see his salvation. To be still and know that he is God. And to be reminded that the battle belongs to the Lord because he is the true king. Now we have just 11 short verses this morning. But in conclusion, our text has several concepts we could take away and chew on, and I hope that we do have a few this morning that we can take and pray through. But the big idea that we'll focus on this week as a group is that remembering who we serve is a compass back to the will of God when we are lost. Say that one more time. Remembering who we serve is a compass back to the will of God when we're lost. There are times in this life when we will find ourselves very out of place, and perhaps out of the will of God, perhaps lost in conformity to the world. Perhaps you feel that way to a degree this morning. Let me remind us, brothers, no matter how far we've drifted, it's always one step back to the right path. And as we'll see next week, there may be some work to do, but knowing the one who we serve reminds us that he will supply everything we need to find our way back again.
Thanks for joining us today for our study of 1 Samuel. For more information on the Friday Men's Breakfast, please visit wcchapel.org/Men's Breakfast. Until next week, our prayer for you is that the King you desire first and foremost is not a mere earthly ruler, but Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of both heaven and earth. God bless.